and welcome to Amazon Web Services webcast, Launch and Learn Amazon EC2 for Microsoft Windows Server. Before we begin, I would like to walk the audience through a few housekeeping items. This webinar contains 3 sections. In the first section, I'm going to walk you through some information about Elastic Compute Cloud for Microsoft Windows Server. In the second section, I will complete a demo for you in which I will launch and configure a Windows virtual machine using the AWS console. After the demo, I will push a link out to you so that you can complete your own lab in the third section. While you're working on your lab, we will remain online to answer any questions you might have. On your screen, you can see a question pod. This is where you will type and submit your questions for our presenters at any time to answer during this webcast, during the live session or during the presentation or the demo. Today's webcast is being recorded, and we will send you a follow-up email with the URL to the recording as well as a link to the presentation deck. After we walk through the informational and demo sections, we will provide everyone with free access to complete our on-hands lab. And again, welcome to today's webinar, Launch and Learn Amazon EC2 for Microsoft Windows Server. My name is Michael Sutton. I am your instructor for today. I am a technical trainer with Amazon Web Services. I have been so for about a little over a year now, and I teach a lot of the system operations architecting courses. So let's go ahead and get started. So when we think about traditional computing challenges in a physical environment, when we think of building architectures in this manner, we know we have a heavy upfront expense, the cost of the servers, the cost of the operating systems, the cost of the data center space. In most cases, we have poor utilization of these physical servers as well, because most physical boxes are typically over-engineered or have too many resources for what we're trying to do. The process to get these servers online and running can be a slow process, and it could also be costly in terms of all the equipment and pieces we need to buy to make it work. So then we wonder, why are people flocking to the cloud? Well, first off is to exchange a capital expenditure for a variable expense. We could also lower that variable expense when we compare it to on-premises type data centers where we have to pay for the cooling, the heating, the space, and all those other types of items. There is also a way that we can make our applications more elastic or be able to expand and contract based on resource usage. And it gives us a better use of scarce resources. I don't have to over-engineer any part of my architecture. The result of this makes my infrastructure much more agile. I'm able to expand and contract as needed, and it allows me to go global very quickly rather than having to wait through the process of receiving servers, setting them up to work, bootstrapping, and all those other things. It makes it much more efficient in the cloud environment where I don't have to go through those options. So when we talk about AWS, we have the most expansive technology infrastructure platform to date. Whether it's our world-class support, dealing with our support, our professional services, or whether it's our enterprise applications, which include the virtual desktop or the sharing collaboration features, or the over 40 platforms and services that we offer, the different tools that are available for administrating and securing this architecture against our core services, against also our infrastructure. So we have all these different platforms and services within our infrastructure. So what we're going to focus on in this portion is strictly EC2 for Windows. So when we're talking about Amazon EC2 for Windows, we're talking about resizable compute capacity in the AWS cloud. We're going to be running our Windows operating system and our applications inside of a virtual machine. Within this process, we can scale up or down quickly as needed, whether we want to do it by schedule, whether we want to do it by usage, by performance. We're only going to pay for what we use. So if I have 10 servers running, but I really only need 2, I can get rid of those 8 servers and I'll no longer pay for those services. And a lot of the look and feel of the architecture is going to be that familiar Microsoft Windows Server operating system. We connect to these virtual machines the same way we would connect to a physical box. We'll use remote desktop. We'll connect using fully qualified domain names or IP addresses, and we'll have usernames and passwords, just like we do physically now. So when we start to talk about the benefits of EC2 for Windows, you're going to see a lot of different topics here, including security, how we can secure this down, how we can make these infrastructures more reliable in a cloud environment, how we can build high-performance instances using this same familiar interface that we've all become familiar with over the years with Windows, and we'll see how we can do it in a cost-effective manner using an extensive library of platform services, and we can be very flexible in how we do this. So when we talk about the ways that we can secure our instances, we can take the same approaches we take in a physical environment, where we have a defense in-depth type approach where there are many different layers to protect our systems. The instances themselves are isolated infrastructures and workloads. We do have the ability to set up identity and access control systems within these instances, and there are also tools available where we can audit and make sure that we're in compliance with whatever regulations we need to be in compliance with. With reliability, we offer a 99.95 SLA to include multi-region synchronous replication. We have the ability to monitor for performance and uptime with low network variability. When it comes to high performance, we do offer enterprise-grade computing on demand. We have automation tools available for both complex and routine tasks. If you are using some tools in the physical environment and you want to transpose those into a cloud environment like AWS, we can do that. We have dedicated low latency network connections. We have methods where we can automatically scale based on schedule, based on performance, and we have monitoring tools built into the infrastructure where we can configure these user-defined thresholds. We also have the ability to monitor using commercial tools available. Familiarity with the Windows operating system will be the same. It's going to be the same look and feel of using a physical instance, of using another virtual machine. We'll still use the same tools like remote desktop or SSH clients to access our instances. These are your own servers. There is no sharing of services or anything like that when it comes to the instances. You create the instance is isolated, you own the instance. We're going to utilize virtual machines to make this happen. You can license your applications whatever way you see fit, whether it is bringing your own licenses or using licenses in another matter, and you can use your existing management tools with this infrastructure. If you're familiar with Performance Monitor or tools like that, you can still use these options within the instances. Building infrastructures in the cloud becomes a very cost-effective option because we're able to trade that capital expense where we had to invest a lot in the infrastructure, and we can switch to a variable expense where we can basically just spend money on the options we're running. We benefit from massive economies of scale based on Amazon Web Services' large infrastructure. We're going to have you pay only for what you use. So if I'm going to use an instance for an hour, I'll only pay for that hour. There are no long-term commitments. You can shut down instances, you can close out accounts at any time, and you do have the ability to bring your own licenses. As far as services is concerned, we have over 40 services available, not just concerning EC2 instances, but in databases, storage options, network options. There are over 40 of these different services available. We have a broad ecosystem of partners that could also help you with your infrastructures. We have third-party application and marketplaces where we can purchase our applications. We have continuous service improvement. We're constantly looking to improve the infrastructure and how it works. And there are technical certifications available to your employees so you can verify and prove their skills within the AWS architecture. We also have a very flexible architecture. It is highly customizable based upon what you want to do within your architectures. There are a variety of instance types, which we're going to see here in a moment. we're able to maintain availability at the lowest cost possible because in our infrastructure for availability, we're able to run instances in multiple data centers. And as far as the user is concerned, they only pay for the options they're running. And we do offer a wide variety of storage options. And in our case, we think about storage a little bit differently because we think about the purpose of storage, whether it's an object store, archival storage, block level storage. This is how we determine what options are available. So what I'm going to do here now is I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing this presentation, and I want to go through a demo of the lab that you're going to have access to today. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, and we're going to walk through the whole process. So I'm going to go ahead and I will open up a browser, and on this browser we will go to the Qwiklab environment. So if I go to, one moment please. If I go to run.qwiklab.com, now for this lab to work, you're going to need to sign in. Now, if you do have an account, you can use the existing account you already have. If you don't have an account, it's very easy to create an account. You'll just have to give some basic information. Now, the lab that we're going to be doing in this class is going to be the creating an Amazon EC2 instance in Microsoft Windows. So this is the lab that we're going to kick off. So a couple about this lab is you're going to notice, first of all, the manual will appear on your screens when you first get into the lab. This is step-by-step instructions of what we need to do to complete the lab. Now, another tab you're going to notice is this thing called Creating EC2 Instance for Windows Command Text. If I click on this link, this is going to give me a link to a text file. Now, there is going to be some bootstrapping involved in this lab and some typing. So rather than have you type this out, we're going to give you a text screen, a text file that you can copy and paste from. And you'll see how I use this in the example. So I'm going to go ahead and start the. Now, in this case, it's giving me an option how I want to launch the lab, but this lab will be free for you to use in this example. So when I launch the lab, this is going to kick it off for me. So right now I see that my lab is running. One of the items it offers me is some connection information. So here is my management console information. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and copy the password. Then I'm going to select Open Console. Now another way that you can do this is I could also go ahead and if I right-click in a new window, and this will bring up a brand new window for me to run the labs. So my username will be AWS Student. My password is going to be the password that I just copied. And when I sign in, this is going to put me into a live AWS environment. If I look in the upper right-hand corner, it'll tell me the region I'm in. Now, the regions are the clouds that we have within the world. We have 11 regions within the world, each region. What we're here to do is we're going to create a Windows 2012 EC2 instance. So in this example, I'm going to select Launch Instance. Now, if we look on this screen, we can see the options we have for creating an instance, whether we use one of the Quick Start options, which are offerings we have for Amazon Machine Images, which is basically a template for an instance. So I can use these AMIs that we provide. I could also use AMIs that I create. If I have any AMIs that I have created, I can use those as well. I can go to the AWS Marketplace to use AMIs that already have software installed onto them, software I can purchase. Some will be free. And we also have community AMIs. And if you create an account with AWS, for this year you get free tier usage. If I want to see what's available in the free tier, I can use that check mark to show me. So I'm going to select, in my example, Windows Base. Now at this point, that first selection really had to do with selecting the operating system I was going to run. This next option is going to be for the instance type. And this allows me to select how the instance is going to be constructed in terms of how much memory it's going to have, how much CPU is it going to have, what is going to be its network performance, what type of storage it's going to use. Now, in my example, I'm going to select General Purpose T2 Micro, and I can see from this it shows that it is free tier eligible, which means if I'm creating a new account and I'm just getting started with AWS and I want to practice, these are good options to select. So now I select Next. Now I configure my instance details. So how many instances do I want to kick off from the very beginning? I'm going to start with 1. What network do I want to put it on? Now, these are networks that you can construct within AWS for your private environments. In my example here, I'm going to use the default network I have set up. It's going to auto-assign a public IP address to this instance. Now, in our example, we're going to build a web server, so this is pretty important for my web server to work. And we'll talk about some other options of how I can use IP addresses here a little bit later. Now, a couple of these other options: can I join a domain? Some identity and access permissions I can give the instance. If I shut this instance down, do I want this instance to simply stop where I can restart it again? Or do I want to terminate the instance? Now, this other piece we have here is advanced details. Now, this is where we can actually bootstrap our instances. We can put code into this window that can run when the instance. What we're going to do is we're going to put, when we looked earlier, we had this text file that we showed you. I'm going to run a script here where I'm going to run this command, this PowerShell command, inside my instance. And what this is going to do is it's going to start up IIS, or Internet Microsoft Web Server, as part of my installation option. So if I paste that code in here, I'm going to run this PowerShell command. It's going to install some Windows features. It's going to install a web server. Now, when I go next to add storage, this is the storage that comes with the instance. So we see here that we have a root volume. It's going to be about 30 gig in size and is configured for us to use. I can add other volumes if needed by just selecting the Add Volume button and specifying how I want that volume constructed. So when I go next, I go into tagging my instance. Now in this case, I give it a name, and I'm going to call it, for our purposes, Webinar. So tags is a way that I can apply metadata to an instance. So if I want to do searches on the instance, if I want to do things, I can do that. For now, I'm just going to give it a name tag called Webinar, and we'll see where that comes in. Now, when I select Next, it's going to ask me how do I want to configure my security group. My security group is a firewall. I can use a firewall I already have created, or I can create my firewall now. Now, the way a security group works is all traffic inbound is automatically denied. So what we're going to do is we have to decide what traffic we're going to allow into this instance. So I'm going to call this, let's be real creative here, I'm going to call Webinar. And I'll give it a description of Webinar because I like creativity. And we really should use better descriptions for this. But in our case, we're going to set up a couple of rules. Now this is going to allow RDP traffic, so I can RDP into this instance. Now since I'm going to make this a web server, I'm also going to allow HTTP and I'm going to allow HTTPS. So I'll scroll down here. Where is it? There it is. Now, it's going to tell us the protocol, the port range, and who specifically are we going to allow. Now, in this case, we're allowing all traffic from everywhere to connect to this instance, which is really a bad idea. You would really want to limit this, and we can do that very easily by either A, putting in my IP address, which is the IP address where I am sitting right now. I can put in a custom IP address where I can put in a range of IP addresses based on site addressing who I'm going to allow. But for our purposes here, anywhere will work. Now, when I go to review and launch, it's going to basically bring me to a screen that allows me to check all of my configuration if I want to make any changes. Now, in our example, I'm going to say, I'm fine with these changes, and I'm going to launch this instance. Now, what happens next is we're going to have to use a key pair to get into this instance, or a PEM file. Now, the public key is going to be loaded on my instance. The private key is going to be used by me to decrypt the default administrator password. So what we're going to need to do in our labs, if I go back to this lab screen, you're going to see up below the PEM PPK file. So I'm going to download the PEM file, and it's going to go to my downloads folder. So now I can go back to my lab environment. This is going to be my key file. I'm going to acknowledge that I do have this key, because if I did not have this key, I would not be able to log on to this instance. And then I'm going to launch the instance. So now the instance is going to launch. It tells me it's launching. Now I have the option to get notified of estimated bill change charges and things like that. So I can go ahead and view my instances. So if I look, I can see here is my webinar instance, and what you're going to notice on the bottom is we have our instance ID, our instance type, an availability zone is a data center that is built within my region. For example, my region right now, if I look in the upper right-hand corner, that Oregon. So Oregon is the region. A region is made up of availability zones. A good way to think about availability zones is availability zones are data centers. So each region will have at least 2 data centers or 2 availability zones. So in this example, this is going to be in an availability zone called US West 2A. Now right now the instance is running, but it's showing as a status of initializing. So right now, instance is starting up. We're starting the build. When this is ready and this is started properly, it's going to basically tell me instance completed, or status checks to have completed, which tells me that my instance started successfully, and it'll give me a green indicator for this. Now, if we look at this a little bit further, we see that it has a public DNS name. We also see that it has a public IP address. Now, since we created this instance in a network that allowed it to give it an IP address, we're running a DHCP service inside this network. So these public IP addresses are being distributed automatically based upon that setting we had when we constructed the instance. Now, what's really important to mention here is that this public IP address can change if I stop and start this instance. So right now I have a 52.24.226.67 network. It is entirely possible that if I go ahead and I start this, stop it and start it again, I'm going to have a different IP address. So the last part of this lab is going to address the problem is, what if I want to give it a static IP address? What if I don't want the IP address to change? We can do that, and we'll see how here in a moment. So we see we have the monitoring disabled. This is our launch time. Here's our security group. Now, if we look below, this is where we have a lot of this same information. So this right here is my fully qualified domain name, what I just highlighted. So we do give it a public DNS in this instance. Now this doesn't have to be the case. A lot of this is really dependent upon how the network I put it in was constructed. Here's my public IP address. Now, if we were to give this instance IP address, this is what we call an elastic IP address, which we're going to show how we can set this up here in a moment, because we do have the ability to create elastic IP addresses. So what we also have is we have our public IP address. Here's our security group we created. If I wanted to view what rules I have created, I can do that and it will show them. My AMI ID, it'll tell me the platform. Another key thing to understand is we will list what key we are using to log into this instance, which we're going to show here in a moment. Right? So all of this gets created. So let's go ahead and walk through the process of how we would log in to this instance. Now, right now, the instance isn't finished yet, but hopefully by the time we get to that point, it will be. Now, if you look, I have an indicator here on the left of the name of the instance that I can select. And if I hit the connect button, it's going to set me up to connect to my instance. Now, I have a couple of options here. The first thing I can do here is I can go ahead and download this file. And if you look in the lower right-hand corner, we see that it sets up a remote desktop shortcut file for us. Now, the public IP address right now for this instance is listed here. In Windows, by default, we log in as administrator. So all we need to do now is get the password. So if I select the Get the Password button, and I go ahead, it's going to tell me what key it is expecting, what key file. Now remember what I said earlier, our key files, when we download them, it's going to put them by default in our download folder of Virtual Desktop. So if I go ahead and choose a file, and I go to Downloads, and I go by date modified, this key file here is to be a match to the screen in the background. So when I open, it's going to basically, as it is right now, it doesn't really do me any good until I decrypt it. Now, when I decrypt it, it decrypts it into the administrator password. So if I go ahead and I copy this, and I close it, I will then be able to log in using this key file. Now, what I can do in this case is I can basically use a shortcut file. So if I click on the shortcut file, hold on one second. Okay, and I'm sorry about that. So for a moment, if I go ahead and I select Connect, it's going to open up NP Desktop for me. So if I go ahead and I paste in my password and I hit OK, what this is going to do is log me into the instance. So right now it's configuring the remote session. When the remote session is configured, it is going to go ahead and open up the instance. Now, this is the first part of the lab that we're going to perform. So we're going to go ahead, we're going to open up this instance. Now remember what this instance is, right? It's a Windows-based 2012 instance that we created, but we also added a PowerShell command to install a web server on this instance for us. So when this comes up, we'll be able to go to Server Manager and make some changes. And that's what part 2 of this lab is going to do. So we see the instance is spinning up. Now, one of the important things to note when this comes up as well, eventually in the upper right-hand corner, we'll see here in a moment, it's going to bring up some details about our instance. And we'll see that here, right here in a moment. So we see our host name, our instance ID. Here's our public IP address, our private IP address, what availability zone it's in. It gives us a lot of details about our instance. Now, if I go to Server Manager, which is the button in the lower left-hand corner by the Windows icon, Server Manager is going to start. Now, I'm going to wait for this to come up for a moment. When I go to Local Server, this is going to start loading the different aspects of this server, including the web server that we installed as part of this. But before we get it, I need to change some Internet Explorer enhanced security configuration for this lab. Now, the lab will walk you through this, but what we're going to do basically is we're going to turn off the security configurations for this, just for this lab in this example. Now, when I select OK, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to refresh. And as a result of that, when we see IE Enhanced Security Configuration, this refresh should now show this as off. What I should also see here eventually is I should see this screen on the left-hand side get populated with the IIS feature, so we can go ahead and go through the process of configuring our web server, which should show up here in a moment. So what we did so far was we went ahead, we installed the instance, we logged in. We now went ahead, turned off some IE Advanced Security configuration features, just for this lab. Now we're going to go ahead and go into IIS. So this is going to be our web server. So what we're going to do is I'm going to right-click on my server, and I'm going to open up Internet Information Services Manager window. And now when this opens up, I can go ahead and manage my web server. This is an example of the PowerShell script that we set up now running for us. So now I can go ahead, I can expand on my server, I see my sites, and I have my default site. So to see that this works, let's see what it looks like for a moment. So if I right-click on this, and I go to Manage, and I browse, this is going to bring up the IIS server for me. Hold on one moment, please. Okay. So now we see what the default browser looks like in this example. What we're going to do as part of this lab is we're going to make some changes to this. So here I have my default website. I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to right-click on it again. But now I'm going to go to Explore. And the lab will walk you through this piece. So if we go to Explore, it's going to bring us to the default location of the files for IIS. So local drive, inetpub, www.root. And if I go to www.root, here is my configuration file. This is the file that we just used. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and right-click on the file. I'm going to open this with Notepad. And I'm going to make some changes to this, just for the heck of it. So I'll get rid of all this fancy style stuff because we don't really need this. And the lab will walk you through this. And then I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to go back into my lab environment. And what I'm going to do in this case now is I'm going to go back to my lab, and if we remember that file we had, I'm going to replace the default links with these links here. Now what this is really doing, it is allowing me to link to the metadata about this instance, which is available for us to use for bootstrapping purposes. But for our case, what we're going to do is we're going to use it as a way to display information on my default website. So if I get rid of this and I replace it with those links, I'm going to save this file. And now, if I go back to my IIS Manager window, and I go to my default browser, my default site rather, excuse me, and I right-click on it, and I go to Manage Website, Browse, basically what we did here was we went ahead and changed the default window to these different links. And what these links actually lead to is metadata about my instance. Now, what's interesting about this metadata is I can use this metadata as a method for bootstrapping my instances. They can call this metadata as a way of configuring my scripts to run to configure my servers. So, for example, I look at this link, it tells me what availability zone I'm in. Here is the actual script I ran, or in this case the command I ran, to install the web server. This is all the metadata about the instance we created. So now, we saw how our instance, we were able to create the instance, we were able to log into the instance, we were able to configure the instance, in this case a web server, to do some work for us. Now, what's going to be next is, let's go ahead and solve a common problem people have with this instance. One of it being, we want to give this instance a static IP address. If I shut down this instance and I start it again, I'm going to get a new IP address. So what I want to do now is I want to apply an elastic IP address to this instance. Now, if I look at the menu options in the left side of the window, I'm going to see all sorts of options. When I get to network and security, I'm going to see one called elastic IPs. Now, these are public IP addresses that I can get from AWS to apply to my instances. So I can select the allocate new IP address. And when I select yes, allocate, this is going to return a public IP address that is now permanent, that can now be applied to an instance, and whether I shut this instance down, reboot it, stop it, start it, this IP address is not going to change. So the first part of this was to allocate the address. If you look in the toward the upper left middle, you'll see a button called Associate Address. If I click on that button, and under my instances, I see my instance ID for my webinar instance. So it is going to apply this instance to this IP address. When I select Associate, it is now going to change the IP address of this instance to the instance I built. So if I go back to instances again, I'm going to see under public IP address, I now have a setting for elastic IP address. You see where my mouse is, where it has it highlighted. This is the public IP address that will now statically stay with this instance. I can associate and deassociate, allocate and deallocate addresses at any time. And just to prove that this works, I'm going to go ahead, I'm going to copy this address. If I go ahead and I open a new tab in this example, I'm going to go ahead and if I hit that, if I put in the IP address, I open up a new link, it should lead me to my original website that we saw earlier. So we basically changed our address from a public IP address that can change to a public IP address that will not change. So now I will go ahead